So good afternoon and good morning and evening, depends on where you are. And welcome to our webinar discussion of calculating cost and carbon savings of clean heating and cooling technologies. A look at CESA's progress, hosted by the Renewable Thermal Alliance. I am Cece Geng, a Master of Environmental Management candidate at the Yale School of the Environment. I'm supporting the team at the Renewable Thermal Alliance, and I'm very excited to facilitate today's event. First, I want to thank you all for being here today. And before I dive into more details about the Renewable Thermal Alliance and officially welcome our speakers, I want to make a few quick logistical notes. First, I want to invite all of you to share any questions throughout the webinar through the Q&A panel. We have enabled the upvote function, so you can upvote questions from other attendees if you are also interested in hearing the answers to the question. And we'll have a dedicated time for questions at the end of the webinar. I also want to note that this webinar will be recorded and available on the Yale Center for Business and the Environment website. The link is already on the screen here and posted in the chat later. And the recordings will be available in a couple of days after today. So as I get started, please feel free to use the chat feature to introduce yourself, where you're coming from today. However, I will disable the chat function shortly after my introduction is done. Please post any questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom so that we can keep track of them. All right, now, so diving right in. Today, we're going to hear about a new technology, the Clean Heating and Cooling Calculator, which aims to help homeowners determine cost-saving and climate-friendly heating and cooling options. Right now, the Connecticut and Rhode Island versions will be available soon and free to access. The Massachusetts and New York tools will be released in 2022. As background, renewable heating and cooling are increasingly seen as opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and at the same time, increase energy affordability, reliability, and resilience. Heating and cooling nationwide accounted for respectively 65% and 24% of energy delivered to residential and commercial customers in 2015. But the sector remains dominated by fossil fuels. The Renewable Thermal Alliance, a public-private partnership initiated by NYSERDA, Connecticut Green Bank, and Yale University, which aims to develop the infrastructure for large-scale deployment of renewable thermal technologies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through energy savings and fuel switching. This webinar series highlights recipients of the 2020 Renewable Thermal Alliance Seed Innovation Grants on policy, technology, and market developments in renewable heating and cooling. Today's webinar is the third in the series, and I encourage you to visit the Yale Center for Business and the Environment website at the link, again here, to check out previous webinars and sign up to receive an invitation to our next one, which is happening next week. All right, so that is everything about logistical details and the background of Renewable Thermal Alliance. Now I want to welcome Val Stori from the Clean Energy States Alliance and Damon Lane from Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. And I will share a short bio about them and then turn things over to them to tell us about this exciting new tool they developed with help from the grant. And we'll leave some time for Q&A towards the end of the event. Also, again, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. All right, first, I want to welcome Val Stori. Val is a project director for the Clean Energy States Alliance, CESA, where she leads projects focused on building electrification and offshore wind policy. She coordinates a multi-state initiative to develop renewable heating and cooling tools that support and accelerate the deployment of renewable heating and cooling technologies, which she's going to talk about today. Additionally, she co-directs CESA's offshore wind project, which is focused on regional state cooperation to decrease costs and accelerate market growth. She has also managed projects focused on stakeholder outreach, small wind turbines, bioenergy, and biomass thermal. She holds a Bachelor of Arts from Middlebury College and a Master of Studies in Environmental Law from Vermont Law School. In addition, Val is currently participating in Yale's financing and deploying clean energy certificate program. She's also serving as a program ambassador to help those interested to learn more about the certificate. Damon Lane has more than a decade of energy analysis and planning experience, including statewide planning for a sustainable future with an emphasis on demand-side fuel switching and high levels of renewable electricity. As the lead analyst at Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, Damon leads the analysis underpinning studies for individual grid circuits, cities and towns, schools and other facilities, and for states. He was the lead analyst and project manager for Vermont Solar Pathways and Finding Pennsylvania's Solar Future. He has a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Penn State and a Master of Science in Sustainable Energy Engineering from the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. All right, now without further ado, I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you, Val.
Okay, there we go. You should be able to see my screen. Thank you, Cece, and thanks everyone for being here. Excited to present an update on the tool for those of you who were able to join us on the last RTA webinar about a year ago, and to introduce the tool to those of you who are joining us for the first time. I want to, there we go, give you an overview of what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to start with a high-level overview on the project, give you some background on the project partners and the why and the when, the how. And then we're going to walk you through, depending on time, 1 or 2 scenarios that we ran through the tool. Damon's going to jump in, provide some details on the methodology and assumptions that went into the tool. We'll review the survey, the scenario results, and then we'll talk about updates to the tool that we are preparing to do next year. So and then we'll move on to Q&A for the last 20 to 15 minutes of the hour. So we have some great project partners for this tool. First of all, as you know, VEIC was our consultant on this tool, and we worked with 4 states. You see the agencies and offices that we collaborated with on this tool up on the screen, and in addition with Avangrid. So these are all our participants in the tool. And we also worked with UMass Clean Energy Extension. They played an advisory role on the project, especially early on as we were devising what this tool might look like and what it should do. They have extensive experience developing clean heating and cooling models for county level planners and project level screening tools that do take into account greenhouse gas savings, costs, and incentives. So why this project and why a regional project? Well, we decided several years ago, I think we came up with this project about 3 years ago, and then raised funds from RTA, some other funders, and from the participating states. We were working together to figure out how we could support the development of a clean heating and cooling market. And many of the state organizations that I work with already had clean heating and cooling programs. Some have Heat Smart and Thermalize campaigns, which are local community-based campaigns that are working to both reduce the cost of clean heating and cooling solutions, but also to get uptake in the market by installing them at the residential level. Well, the states got together and thought that a regional tool could be super helpful in moving the market by sending a consistent message across multiple state lines, and that the states, by coming together and deciding as a region on several assumptions like the efficiency of a heat pump could really standardize and create a levelized playing field. So what we have, or what we will have shortly, is a consumer-facing online project level tool for the residential level that allows the user to calculate and get an estimate for the cost and carbon savings from investing in a clean heating and cooling solution. It does not compare one clean heating and cooling solution to another, but rather if the customer were to switch from their current home's heating fuel or supplement their current home heating fuel, and that could be, we included the traditional fuels in the tool, so which you'll see as we walk through the scenario, but traditional heating fuels and electric resistance. One of the goals is to have a simple yet accurate tool, and I really like this cartoon that you see on the slide because we've been working really hard to narrow down both the user input fields and the assumptions and methodology that's being crunched in the background, the part that the user doesn't see, in a manner that still yields accurate results. And this has been our biggest challenge. We maintain dedicated to having a simple user-friendly tool, yet there is so much data on a home and how we use energy that sometimes it does get overwhelming. But we do think that what we have and what I'll be presenting to you today is a user-friendly tool that should build consumer confidence in clean heating and cooling technologies. So this is the tool, and the tool, as I mentioned, is an online tool. It will live on CESA's website. We have a Rhode Island version, a Massachusetts version, a New York version, and a Connecticut version. And each of the participating states can also choose to embed the tool on their websites. So for example, the idea in Massachusetts is that the tool will live on Mass CEC's Go Clean website. It's their Clean Energy Lives Here website. And for example, in Connecticut, the tool would live on Energize Connecticut's website. And the tool, both on CESA sites and where the states are embedding it, it's being embedded in context. So there's a bunch of introductory language to the tool that talks about, like I just have explained to you, what the tool is, what it does, how to interpret its results, and we'll take a look at that later. All right, so let's dive into the tool. I've taken some screenshots. The important thing to see here is that this is a zip code based tool. The zip code feeds into selecting weather data, which in turn is used to calculate capacity and energy consumption. The zip code is tied into incentives, but at the state level. So we haven't drilled down into zip code based energy pricing or weather or incentive data, but further down the road, we're set up to do that. It also is tied to emission factors by grid zone. And then lastly, energy prices, but again, those are by state. So for today's example, I've chosen a New Haven zip code. And then the next step in the tool is to choose what kind of clean heating and cooling technology you're interested in installing. And here I have shown you the range of options. There are 5 choices: air source heat pumps, both ducted and ductless, ground source heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, and solar hot water. In Massachusetts, you also have the addition of choosing advanced wood heat or wood pellet, also known as wood pellet boilers. So let's move on to the next slide. So I've chosen air source heat pump ductless for our scenario. And then the next module asks us to look at and input the square footage of our home. And this is an important metric, and also a metric where if you put in a value, let's say I put in 300 square feet. So a value outside the range of this tool's allowable range. If I had put in 300 or 300,000 or 30,000, too many zeros, This is where the tool is going to default to REX data. That's the Residential Energy Consumption Survey data. And this is DOE EIA program data on household energy, energy use, occupant behavior, basically any energy data that affects a homeowner's energy bills. And this tool uses REX 2015 data, and it calculates energy intensity based on this data, where if and when there is a user input error. Damon, I'm going to let you jump in here, talk a little bit more about square footage and the REX data.
Sure. And one thing I just mentioned on the selection of the technology someone's interested in on the previous slide, some of these technologies only provide heating, some provide heating and cooling, some are heating and hot water. And so that's one of the reasons we ask that question up front, to know, are we calculating, in almost all cases, we're calculating heating savings, but are we also calculating cooling and or water heating savings? And so there's some different kind of analytical paths through the tool based on that answer. The square footage data is used to provide the capacity of air source heat pumps, and as well to apply the energy intensity of heating data from REX. And REX is a survey where they go in and ask a lot of detailed questions, and they pull the people's actual heating bills. So it's relatively rigorous compared to just a survey where people get to answer what they remember their heating bills were. These are people's real heating bills. So we use that in the event that someone hasn't entered accurate heating consumption data, and we haven't seen that input yet, but people also will be able to, on the next couple screens, enter their heating bills if they do have them. But as Val was saying, if those are wildly different than REX averages, we're going to assume that they made a unit error or some kind of mistake, and we actually won't use really ridiculous numbers there. One challenge, though, with using this REX data is REX has their methodology that includes the square footage of basements in their measurements. And since we're using a heating energy per square foot, we have to use the same method that they use. And a lot of people find it confusing to include the basement square footage, but that's one of the improvements we're working on, making that more clear. There was a question about REC or REX, and it's RECS, and it's a program of EIA, but I can drop a link in the chat to that effect.
Sure. And it stands for, as you can see on your screen, Residential Energy Consumption Survey, if you want to Google it later. Thanks, Damon. All right, so as you progress through the module, this is the next box that pops up. You get to choose the time period that your house was built, and I chose the average year that homes in New Haven were built, between the 1960 and 1969. And then we have some subjective questions around both your home's energy efficiency and how efficient you are as a homeowner or as a resident. And these two are usually set to the default of average, but because I wanted to show you what happens if you move from a below average home to an above average home. In the next scenario, I've changed the default from average to below average. And in the calculations, and Damon, you can jump in here, these two scores are averaged, and they're used to place the subject home within the, and this is where Damon should jump in, within the interquartile range of heating, cooling, or water heating energy data from the REX survey.
Right, that's exactly right. We're going to pull REX data from the person's climate based on heating degree days, and from homes that are the same vintage as the person entered when was it built. But that will give us a range because the survey, it's a big statistical survey. And if people answer average to these two questions, we'll pull the median. But if they use some combination of above or below average, we're going to move in that interquartile range between, I think it's interquartile and not interquantile, but I don't remember that exactly. But basically, we're using the center part of the data, not going into the two ends. But if people answer like this, two too below average or too above average, we're going to move to something like the 25th or the 20th or the 75th percentile. And this is mainly to have, people often want to express this, that, oh, well, I act more or less, I think most people want to express it, act more efficient than other people they know, and they wanted some way to have that included in the results.
Great, thank you. All right, this is the part everyone gets excited about because you get to enter data about your home. And here I am showing you the current options that you can choose from for how you currently heat your home. Let's see, we cover all the bases. If you don't know, we have created and included a Learn More link. And let me show you, oh, you know what? Let me go back. Excuse me for a second, this just reminded me. Okay. If you don't know anything about clean heating and cooling technologies and you don't know how to choose from this list, there is this link here, this light blue link. You can click on it, you'll get a pop-up. It will describe in 3 to 4 sentences what each of these technologies are. And also the website where the tool is embedded also has a link that describes the technologies. So this link here is talking more about your heat distribution system. And we're assuming that most people, if they know what their boiler is, that's great, but they might not know how that boiler is distributing heat throughout the building, if it's forced hot air, or if it's hot water, if it's steam. So we've created this matrix to want to talk you through this, but also to let you know if the clean heating and cooling technology you've chosen is compatible with your home's current distribution system. These show up as pop-ups, so the user doesn't have to leave the website to go gather different information. It pops up, you get a little X. Once you've familiarized yourself with the technology, you can close back out. But basically, it compares your heating distribution system, whether you have ducts or a radiant system, against the clean heating and cooling technologies. You get check marks or X's. X's doesn't mean it's incompatible necessarily. It just means you will have to update or change your distribution system in order when you put in the clean heating and cooling system. And then there's some notes. And that's a little side note. Now we get to the meat of the tool. The following inputs are really important for the tool's accuracy. So for this example, I've chosen that our home in New Haven, our 3,000 square foot home, currently has a boiler that runs on fuel oil. Now I get to enter in how much fuel the home uses, and I can do that in a variety of ways. I can say, I don't know, but 100% of my home uses fuel oil. The tool will go to the REX data and will say, for a home of this size, in your zip code, you should be using X amount of fuel on average based on the REX data. More accurately, you can enter your fuel consumption by gallons, therms, dollars, etc. And what I've done here is to say I'm going to, and it doesn't show up once you click on the choice, then you move on to this next module. So I've said I'm going to input real data. I've got my bills in front of me. I know that I use 1,200 gallons of fuel oil a year. So there's my input. Here's the reminder. This tool relies heavily on this data. If you don't want the data to default to the REX data, it's really worth taking a pause, opening up your files, finding your fuel bills, and seeing if you can come up with average fuel use. Damon, you want to jump in? Anything to add? Okay. All right, so the next module asks you, okay, so you're going to put in a ductless system. How much of the heat load will your ductless air source heat pump use in the future compared to your existing boiler? And I believe this is the default, a 70-30 split. You can choose to do 50-50, 100% zero. These numbers are have a user override built in. It just needs to total up to 100%. And we haven't talked about how the tool treats cooling yet. The tool does take cooling into account. However, if you do not have cooling and you're going to get the cooling benefit from an air source heat pump or a ground source heat pump, that benefit isn't accounted for in the results, and we can talk about that when we get to the results section. But if you do have central air conditioning or a window unit and you indicate that by clicking either of these two bottom choices, the tool does adjust for that AC. So I've chosen that this home does not have air conditioning of any kind.
And said another way, if you install a technology that provides cooling, we assume that you're going to use it. And so the tool will include that additional kilowatt hour consumption. But if you had said you have no air conditioning today, we have no baseline cooling to offset. So that's an increase in cost, at least for the cooling component. And so that's why we're asking this question, do we have any baseline cooling expense? And that can be difficult because the electricity cost goes up, but as Val said, we're not explicitly saying, and you're getting cooling, which is a benefit, and it's actually the reason why a lot of people add heat pumps. So we have to think of a way to display that better. Similarly, this the 70% heat from the heat pump is the default, and it's based on some empirical data from evaluations of programs that have happened so far. A lot of programs now are starting to shift to encourage people to use their heat pumps for more, and they're more cost effective when you run them more, or up until a certain temperature where you switch over to your traditional system. But that's one of the points where we're investigating in the future. Should we increase that number and possibly even differentiate if someone is using their heat pump for 100% of their heating, they save more for all the amount that they're using it, but they probably also had to get a more expensive, higher capacity system. And so how to account for that, which this version of the tool doesn't currently do that, but it's something that we're considering.
And we'll talk about everything we're considering for version 2.0 in just a little bit, but Damon, you reminded me of two things I should cover. The default, for example, for a ground source heat pump is 100%. You could change that, but not sure why you would. So there are different default settings for different clean heating and cooling technologies. Before I hit calculate savings, I want to point out, so that's the entire module. Those are 10 or so questions that the homeowner needs to fill in. Again, as a reminder, we did not cover how the tool treats domestic hot water, and happy to answer questions later on about that. But just for simplicity's sake, we decided not to cover that in these scenarios. So before I hit calculate savings, I wanted to talk about what you're not seeing, which is a huge mastermind spreadsheet built by Damon and the team at Hvac. And this goes back to why I feel that it's very important that this is a regional tool, because there are certain data assumptions that are happening in the background that we have all decided from. Like, we've decided on the data sets, we've decided on the COP of the heat pump, of the ground source heat pump, etc. And we've decided what percent of heating and cooling load, for example, an air source heat pump ductless unit should cover in the home. So the importance of doing this on a regional scale is that even though you're going to get a different result due to differences in energy prices, differences in incentive values, the methodology and the assumptions are the same across the region, and we feel that consistency can send a strong market signal. All right. The results. The tool presents results in annual fuel and electricity savings and annual emission savings. It also, and I'll walk through this, equipment and installation cost range and net equipment and installation cost range. So these are the results from the scenario we just ran. Note that your annual fuel and electricity savings are in parentheses. This indicates a negative savings. If this homeowner were to switch to a ductless air source heat pump, they would see an increase in their fuel cost of $936. Now, again, this is not accounting, this number is accounting for some cooling benefits, whereas we haven't really been explicit about that. In addition, this tool isn't covering or differentiating between replacement costs and displacement costs or an entirely new supplemental system. So there are things to keep in mind. Next, annual emission savings. We've presented the results of greenhouse gas emission savings in both pounds and tons, and in their equivalent miles from an ICE vehicle. So how the greenhouse gas savings equivalent to driving your car 12,000 miles. For those of you who like charts, these are the same figures on a chart. All right, and here we get to the equipment and installation cost range, the available incentives, and the net equipment and installation cost range. This tool is meant to provide a range of estimates, which is why you have a low and a high projection for both your equipment installation cost range and your net range. And here, so the tool does apply federal and state incentives. There's not much transparency within the tool itself, but the website, at least on the CESA side, on which the tool is embedded, there's a little expando box. You click on the one that says incentives and it talks you through, okay, this tool automatically is applying the federal ITC and state incentives, and it tells you exactly which ones. Let's say you are a low income customer and you have a low income adder. You can add that additional incentive here, or let's say there's an additional incentive from moving off of electric resistance heat to a clean heating and cooling technology. You could add that adder or any kind of adder additional incentive into these boxes, and you'll see a change in net equipment and installation costs.
We add the that range at the point where we're assuming we're estimating the capital cost. And because there is a big range in capital costs, we don't really know, but even there's a big range in the capacity. And the drawing at the very beginning, the comic showing all the measurements going into a home energy score, that's really the kind of calculation that you're supposed to do to figure out the capacity of heating a house needs. You're supposed to look at the area and U value or R value of all of the thermal shell and assume something about the leakage. And there's no way we could get that amount of information in a calculator like this. But we felt like one of the most important things to convey to people is the scale of costs or the scale of investments that they might face, because people might not realize there's a significant difference in cost between, say, an air source heat pump and a ground source heat pump. And we just like to inform them that there are. And of course, the ground source heat pump is going to save you more and can provide more service, but people need to have an understanding of the scale that that's talking about. So we do our best to estimate based on empirical data from some central systems on how the total energy consumption over the year correlates with the capacity. And then for air source heat pumps, we have a different method that has to do with the efficiency of the structure and how old it is and the winter design temperature, since of course the air source heat pumps are sensitive to winter design temperature. But all of that goes into the equipment cost estimates. And the federal ITC we mentioned is only available for a few of the technologies, for pellet boilers where those have a state incentive, and for ground source heat pumps and solar water heaters.
And we have them set up to ratchet down over time as the ITC ratchets down. Yeah, I'm going to toggle back to the last slide because I want you to take a look at the annual emission savings. I've written these numbers down, but try to keep them in your mind, as well as the annual electricity savings, and in this case, an increase, because the next two scenarios that we've run will show a different story. So what I wanted to do was to show you how, and we encourage users to start over, edit, view report. And so I'm going to edit our scenario. I'm not going to change anything about the home other than how efficient the home is. So let's say I've weatherized and I've insulated the attic, which then has decreased the amount of fuel oil I use. So those are the two changes I've made on the next scenario. I encourage anyone who uses the tool to first view and save your report before you do edit or start over, and talk about that in a few minutes. All right, so as I said, I've changed the energy efficiency and personal energy conservation. And so I have inputted that the home uses less fuel. I reduced the fuel oil use for this home by 300 gallons as a result of the energy efficiency measures that I've taken. And I toggled from below average to above average on those two efficiency objective scores. And what you see is that we have gone from an increase of $936 in new fuel costs to $479. And look at what has happened to our greenhouse gas emissions. We've lowered those from about 11,400 pounds to 9,200 pounds. And we've reduced the amount of miles from 12,300 to about 10,000. So quite the impact there on both costs and emissions. And also changes to our net equipment installation cost range, and that is likely because we needed a smaller system. The incentives changed as well, a smaller incentive for a smaller system. But overall, net equipment and installation costs are lower than in the first scenario. Okay, now I have run a new scenario, again, using the same home inputs. I've stuck with wanting to install a ductless air source heat pump, except I have changed the inputs from having a fuel oil boiler to a home that runs on electric baseboard. And I did a little research the other day and saw that 25% of New Haven's housing stock is still running on electric baseboard. So I thought this would be a good switch. And check it out. The homeowner will now save an estimated $522 a year. Greenhouse gas emissions, 1,500 pounds. Vehicle miles avoided, about 1,600. I think that's all I had there. Damon, you want to jump in or want me to move on?
I think you can address maybe one of the questions here.
Sure.
One of the questions was the annual costs go up. This is in the the first scenario actually, $936 after an investment of about $10,000. That's a tough sell. Yes, it is. People wouldn't make that investment. That's not an investment. I mean, it may be an investment in comfort or there's some other benefits, an investment in carbon reduction, but it's not a good financial estimate. And this calculator is not designed simply to move heat pumps, but it's designed to help people make informed decisions about switching their heating systems. And some combinations are going to work and some aren't going to work. But I think one other thing that's driving this to some extent too is we're probably all now, if we've been watching news about energy prices, we know that fossil heating prices are high right now. And the tool isn't using that super up-to-date information. So we maybe would expect different results if it was, but the investment is really going to be recouped on the average prices over the whole life of the system. And that's the future prices. We don't know those future prices. So we don't think it's necessarily necessary to use the latest prices, but to use kind of long-term representation prices. But really what the tool does is use use the ones that were available at the time an update was done, as long as they don't seem like they're out of the trend. But yeah, not all of the scenarios do yield good results.
That is very true. Thank you for keeping an eye on some of those questions and asking them when they're apropos. I would say too, maybe the next thing we can talk about are some of the tool updates that we're envisioning. Certainly, we started working on this tool 3 years ago, so there are some data points that Damon, such as the ones Damon just mentioned, that could use some updating. But the tool also doesn't account for the cost of financing. So one potential upgrade to the tool is that to include a financing line, probably on the last page, where you can enter in whether or not your project can be financed. And if it can, there's no initial investment required, perhaps, and maybe your monthly payments are smaller than the value of energy savings. So a project financed under such conditions is going to be paying you back immediately. My home, wood stove, fossil fuel, radiant floor, boiler, air source heat pump didn't make sense with the price of fuel oil, but with the great financing package and the opportunity to reduce our fossil fuel oil, for us that was very important. So we think that adding cost of financing, for example, to the tool will make some of these cases more appealing. I'm going to fast forward to tool results. And let me see what time it is. I think I'm going to not show you the results, just talk to you a little bit about if you had hit the view report button after your summary report, you get about a 2 to 4 page PDF that one has saved all your inputs. So if you've forgotten that you said, oh, my home uses 1,200 gallons a year, it has entered in it has saved all your inputs, so you can go back and run another scenario and use the same inputs and play around with some of the more objective ones. Or you could say, oh, I'm going to weatherize, so I'm going to assume I'm going to reduce my fuel use, and then compare and contrast results. In addition, the tool presents you with your cost saving details, your emission saving details, and how to interpret these results. I'm going to pause here. Maybe I'll stop sharing my screen. Give me a second. Where's my stop sharing? So we can move on to Q&A. So CC mentioned that we are that this is an update webinar. So over the last year, we have added Rhode Island to the tool. Massachusetts has had some incentive changes. So when we built the tool was set for a flat rate incentive structure. And then Massachusetts and Rhode Island have instituted incentives based on your current fuel. So one incentive rate if you're switching from oil or propane to a clean heating technology, a different incentive rate if you're switching from electric resistance to a clean heating technology. So Damon went back in and created if-then statements to follow the flow of the incentives based on your current fuel input. We have also updated for the New York version of the tool, New York capital costs data for certain technologies, and air source heat pump installation costs based on updated New York data. And then, as we talked about, we updated the federal ITC for several technologies and added the pellet boiler ITC. What we are discussing now is getting ready to launch this first version of the tool. And I believe that you will see Rhode Island and Connecticut's version launched and publicly available quite soon. And for Massachusetts and New York later next year, there are some updates we would like to make to the tool before launching those. For example, energy costs by zip code. So as I mentioned at the start, energy costs are now by zip code in theory, but they cover an entire state. In a state like New York, where fuel prices, energy costs really vary from region to region, it's imperative that New York's tool have zip code based energy prices. So that's a priority update there. We mentioned end of life replacement and the need to distinguish between replacement and the incremental cost savings from not having to replace. AC benefits, so accounting for those cooling savings. And then improving the toggle for energy efficiency improvements. Like, what if the homeowner knows that she's planning for some weatherization retrofits in the next year? How can she go back and play around with the inputs to capture those potential savings? We will also go back, Damon mentioned this, look at some of the tool's assumptions on the load covered by the clean heating and cooling technology, particularly for air source heat pumps. The tool does not currently account for the variability in ductwork costs. So should it, could it, and how? And then lastly, the financing and some clarity on incentives, so that the user doesn't have to toggle back to a previous web page, but to have it very clear, this is the incentive and the incentive rate that this scenario has applied. Damon, any other comments before we jump over to Q&A?
No, I think those are a lot of the good improvements that we've realized through some testing of this tool. I think you mentioned stopping sharing your screen, but we're still seeing the unminimized PowerPoint.
Thank you. Okay.
And so some of the questions are, one I can answer, for example, is someone who's using hot water heating from gas, heating their home and their hot water with gas heating. Is there a way that is included? And that is shown when you choose a renewable technology or a clean technology that provides water heating, such as a pellet boiler. And then we'll ask about your water heating systems, or people can go through and do the analysis not on a kind of hybrid heat and hot water system, but purely on water heating systems like solar water heating systems or heat pump water heaters.
Thanks. Cece, can we pass it back to you?
Great. Thank you so much, Val and Damon, for walking us through the clean heating and cooling calculators. And thank you so much for the audience for being here and for the great questions that you've already posted. Now, so far, we've learned a bit more about the calculator. We will continue with a really short facilitated discussion, and then we'll dive right into the audience Q&A. And before we start the discussion, I want to briefly note again, this webinar will be recorded and available on the Yale Center for Business and the Environment website. And you can also share any questions, again, through the Q&A panel on Zoom, and I will address them later. And if you see any questions that you're excited about, please also upvote them. All right, great. I think that covers the logistics. So Val and Damon, I understand that you've been working on this tool for a few years, and you mentioned earlier some of the data needs updating. So I'm wondering, what are some of the current data gaps, and how do you think the tool can be further improved? And how often do you imagine this tool to be updated?
Yeah, one of the data gaps that I think we're in active conversation about is, we know the pandemic has changed the prices of a lot of things, and getting contractors to do any work in houses is more difficult and more expensive. Is that an effect that we should include? Should we assume that's going to continue? We don't know. How much data do we have on that? Does it vary by different places? So those are some of the questions we'll be looking at in terms of the capital cost data I think the distinction between heat pumps that are providing 100% of heating and ones that are providing 80 or less percent of heating is an important area for us to improve upon, just because those are kind of fundamentally different things. Does the heat pump need to deal with, specifically air source heat pumps, do air source heat pumps need to deal with extremely cold outdoor temperatures or not? Those are some of the things that come to my mind. And I think we envision it being updated. I don't think we said quarterly, but I think semi-annually or annually. You know, it feels like incentive changes would be the thing that would really trigger it. Incentives don't change so often that it would be too burdensome to update it for every kind of major incentive change. There might be some minor tweaks that would happen too often, but updating it every several months based on that seems, 6 months or every year seems appropriate to me.
The partner I didn't mention is our web developer and designer ROI selling, and we have basically an annual subscription with them to update the tool as needed. So for simple things that don't require a change in logic flow. So they'll provide us with a template, we plug in the new incentive numbers, and they feed it into the tool, for example.
Great, thank you. That's really good info. And now we only have about 10 minutes left. So I want to dive right into the good audience questions. And I want to start with Eric's incentive questions. And also, I think that is also a little bit mentioned by Christina. So how are the incentives being updated and I guess also included in your tool? And is this a moving target? Can you link the customers to the programs?
Yeah, so that is transparency on the incentives the tool is using is definitely something that's on our radar. As I mentioned, the website where the tools are embedded currently show per state what incentives are going into the tool, but that's a step that the user has to take, right? They have to click on that incentive expando box to understand, okay, this tool put in a $1,200 value incentive value if I'm going from electric resistance to an air source heat pump in Rhode Island, for example. So it does use state level incentives and federal ITC.
Great, thank you. And also Christina asked about what is being done to increase awareness of geothermal options in public mindset and other like tax credits or other incentives available for geothermal options.
There is the federal ITC for ground source heat pumps, and I believe all 4 of our states have ground source heat pump incentives. I don't know off the top of my head. Damon, does that seem right?
I think they do, and we know some of them are going pretty aggressively, have very, very high incentives. And I'd say this calculator and those incentive programs are the things that seem to be available to help increase awareness and push more people towards that super efficient option. And yeah, the extension of the federal tax credit was significant too.
Yeah. One thing that the tool does, the COP value for ground source heat pump is higher than that for both an air source heat pump ducted and ductless, for example. And my sense is that the landing pages for this tool on the state pages will be on sites where there is a whole bunch of consumer-friendly information on these different technologies.
Great, thank you. And we have a really good question from Tyler. First, great work on the tool. And are there any programs planning on using Hvac contractors as the primary users and messengers?
That's a great question. So when we were first talking about this tool, some of our state partners had just launched Heat Smart / Thermalize campaigns. And we wanted to build this tool for that audience, for both the volunteers that are going door to door and trying to get homeowners to sign up for Heat Smart or Thermalize, but also for the contractors and installers involved with those programs. And that said, it's likely that most contractors have their own much more sophisticated tools than ours, but we would hope that they would use them when they first make contact with a homeowner, or that a homeowner shows the installer they're working with, hey, I ran this initial scenario. How do these results look to you?
Great. Looking back on the question list, I think Lori also has a really good question. She's wondering, how would a homeowner become aware of this great tool? And I guess to add on to that, how can homeowners, how do you motivate homeowners to make change based on the results of the tool?
So once these tools are ready to go live, we will do press releases, more webinars, and especially to, for example, the Heat Smart and Thermalize campaigns. So we do have an outreach plan that we will put in effect once we're ready to launch. As for the second question, how to motivate homeowners, let me know if you come up with the answer. No, I think, the current volatility we're seeing right now with gas prices, I think is an important message that this tool somehow should capture, whether we update the fuel prices before we launch. Certainly the websites where these tools are embedded do a really nice job, where they will be embedded, do a nice job of walking the potential interested consumer into the many benefits of clean heating and cooling technologies, from reducing your carbon emissions to improving your indoor air quality.
The tool is meant to be a third-party evaluation of how much you might save with an investment in a clean heating and cooling technology. And so specifically in that way, it's not a contractor who wants you to hire them to install the system. It's a state program or a third party saying, this probably would save you money on your heating. So that should be helpful, and it's meant to play a somewhat different role that way.
Great. We have a question from Yu. He or she is asking, how is this project funded by the states? Is this just for single family? In a multi-family setting, sometimes the homeowners may not know their systems well enough to input the data.
Yes, this version is single family. Maybe small commercial, it doesn't have to be residential, but a standalone building. How it's funded, we received 2 grants from the Renewable Thermal Alliance. We also received funding from the Hunt Foundation, and our participating states have also contributed to the development of this tool.
Great, I think we have time for one last question. From Ayush. He's asking, how does this model incorporate building material properties and how that affects the thermal conductivity of the heating space?
It doesn't. If you have accurate fuel bills from the past, those should reflect the efficiency of your materials, but there's a lot more detail in that the tool doesn't consider.
Oh, thanks. And wondering, is there anything that, before we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to share, Val and Damon?
Be on the lookout for the announcement of the launch of the first couple of tools. We will share it with RTA, and I'm sure you will all receive a notice as you did for this webinar. Thank you for having us.
And when the tools do roll out, check out the detailed report that's available. Some of the questions we're asking, do you break out heating and cooling energy and costs, and do you show the actual cost, fuel energy cost consumed? Those are not in the web results, but they're in the tool, or the report that you can download.
Great. thank you so much for being here again. And I really enjoyed learning more about your work with the grant and beyond. And I will leave my email address in this chat if anyone wants to get contact through me. Great. And as I mentioned earlier, the recording of this event will be posted on the Yale Center for Business and the Environment website. I also already posted that in the chat. And again, next Thursday, we'll be hosting our 4th and final webinar in this series. And I am also going to post the invitation link in this chat, so you can register if you are interested. And thank you again, Val and Damon, and our great audience for being here. And I think we will end here.
Thanks, Cece. Thanks, Damon.